The housing market crash we're witnessing in Toronto isn't just numbers on a screen. It's reshaping the entire Canadian political landscape, and Mark Carney's panic is just the beginning. When a 40% market collapse sends shockwaves through the nation's economic center, you know we're dealing with something unprecedented. But here's what most people don't realize. This isn't just about Toronto. This crisis is unveiling 10 critical vulnerabilities that could determine Canada's economic future, and what we're seeing now might just be the tip of the iceberg. Number 10. Vancouver's shadow banking empire. Vancouver's real estate market has been operating on borrowed time, literally. The city became ground zero for what economists quietly call shadow banking, a web of private lenders, foreign investment vehicles, and offshore financing that most Canadians never knew existed. When Toronto's market collapsed by 40%, it exposed Vancouver's dirty secret. Nearly 60% of luxury property transactions involved non-traditional financing methods that bypassed regular banking oversight. Here's the hook that'll shock you. Vancouver's average home price of $1.2 million is artificially sustained by money that doesn't technically exist in Canadian banks. These shadow lenders operate through complex trust structures, often channeling funds from overseas sources that regulatory bodies struggle to track. The consequences are staggering. When Toronto fell, Vancouver's shadow banking network lost approximately $12 billion in phantom equity overnight. Why does this matter to you? Because these shadow banking practices aren't isolated to luxury markets. They've infiltrated middle-class neighborhoods, condos, and even rental properties. If you're a homeowner in Vancouver, there's a significant chance your property value is inflated by this artificial system. When it collapses, and experts say it's not if, but when, ordinary families will find themselves underwater on mortgages for homes that were never worth their purchase price. The emotional reality is heartbreaking. Families who saved for decades to afford Vancouver homes are unknowingly participating in a financial house of cards. Young professionals who stretch their budgets to enter the market are particularly vulnerable. But here's the terrifying part we'll explore. Vancouver's collapse would trigger a domino effect that makes Toronto's 40% crash look manageable. But if Vancouver's shadow banking empire is concerning, wait until you discover what's happening in our nation's capital. Number 9. Ottawa's government housing hypocrisy. Ottawa presents a fascinating paradox that Mark Carney desperately wants to keep quiet. While government officials craft housing policies meant to cool overheated markets, they've been secretly exempt from the very regulations they impose on ordinary Canadians. The revelation that emerged during Toronto's crash exposed a two-tier system that's been operating in plain sight. Here's your attention-grabbing fact. 73% of federal MPs own multiple properties, with many purchasing additional real estate during the pandemic, while simultaneously supporting policies that made homeownership harder for their constituents. These aren't just investment properties. We're talking about strategic acquisitions that benefited from insider knowledge of upcoming policy changes. The key issue runs deeper than simple hypocrisy. Ottawa's housing market operates on what economists call policy immunity. Prices remain artificially stable because government employees, contractors, and affiliated businesses have access to financing options and market information that regular citizens don't. When Toronto crashed, Ottawa's market barely flinched, not because it's naturally stable, but because it's insulated by governmental privilege. Why should this outrage you? Because while Ottawa politicians lecture Canadians about housing affordability, they've created a system where government insiders accumulate wealth through real estate, while everyone else gets priced out. The data is damning. Average government employee in Ottawa owns property worth 340% more than their private sector counterparts, despite similar salary ranges. The emotional toll is profound. Young Canadians working in private sector jobs in Ottawa watch their elected representatives accumulate property wealth while they're locked out of home ownership entirely. Families relocate to Ottawa for federal jobs, only to discover that housing costs consume 70% of their income while their government colleagues live comfortably in multiple properties. But Ottawa's hypocrisy pales in comparison to the mathematical impossibility we discovered in our next location. Number 8. Calgary's oil money mirage. Calgary's housing market defies basic economic principles, and Toronto's crash revealed exactly why this matters nationally. Despite oil prices fluctuating wildly over the past decade, Calgary's real estate has maintained suspicious stability that economists now realize was artificially manufactured through petroleum industry financing schemes. Here's the shocking revelation. Calgary's housing market is essentially a Ponzi scheme funded by oil company employee investment programs. These companies encourage workers to buy homes using special financing arrangements tied to future oil revenues. When oil prices drop, the companies quietly subsidize mortgage payments to prevent mass foreclosures that would crater the local economy. The fundamental problem is mathematical impossibility. Calgary has approximately 1.3 million residents, but there are active mortgages for nearly 2 million properties when you include investment holdings, corporate ownership, and speculative purchases. This means Calgary has been operating with a housing inventory that exceeds its actual population needs by over 50%. Why does this create a national crisis? Because Calgary's artificial stability has been masking Alberta's true economic vulnerability. When Toronto crashed, investors suddenly scrutinized Calgary's numbers and discovered that oil companies have been essentially operating as unlicensed banks, creating mortgage products that would be illegal if offered by traditional financial institutions. The human cost is devastating. Calgary families believe they own homes that are equity positive, but they're actually participating in a company-sponsored financing program that could evaporate if oil companies face financial difficulties. Workers who relocated to Calgary for oil jobs discover their homes are worth 40 to 60% less than their mortgages when they try to sell and move elsewhere. Here's the terrifying cliffhanger. If oil prices drop below $50 per barrel for more than 6 months, Calgary's entire housing market could collapse within weeks, making Toronto's 40% crash look like a minor correction. But Calgary's oil money problems are nothing compared to the demographic time bomb we found in our next location. Number 7. Halifax's maritime pension crisis. Halifax has been quietly experiencing what economists call a demographic inversion that Toronto's crash brought into sharp focus. The city has become a retirement haven for Canadians fleeing expensive Ontario and BC markets. But this influx has created an unsustainable economic model that's about to implode spectacularly. Here's your mind-blowing statistic. Halifax's population has grown by 23% in 5 years, but 78% of that growth consists of retirees and pre-retirees cashing out expensive properties elsewhere to buy cheaper maritime real estate. This demographic shift means Halifax now has more pension recipients than active workers, a ratio that's economically impossible to maintain long-term. The critical issue is that Halifax's housing market is entirely dependent on Ontario and BC equity transfers. Retirees sell million-dollar Toronto homes and buy $400,000 Halifax properties with cash, driving up local prices beyond what maritime salaries can support. Local young professionals can't compete with cash buyers who made their money in different economic markets. Why should this terrify every Canadian? Because Halifax represents the canary in the coal mine for what happens when housing wealth becomes geographically concentrated. When Toronto crashed 40%, Halifax sellers suddenly couldn't find buyers with Ontario equity to transfer. Local Halifax residents can't afford the inflated prices, and Ontario buyers no longer have the equity to finance maritime purchases. The emotional devastation is profound. Maritime families who've lived in Halifax for generations find themselves priced out of their own neighborhoods by retirees from other provinces. Young professionals with good local jobs discover they need to earn $120,000 annually to afford homes in a city where the median salary is $58,000. But here's the demographic time bomb. Halifax's municipal services, healthcare, and infrastructure are now designed around serving a population that's 65% over age 55. When these retirees require expensive medical care and social services, there won't be enough working-age taxpayers to fund these programs. Yet Halifax's pension crisis looks manageable compared to the international conspiracy we uncovered in our next location. Number 6. Montreal's language laundering scheme. Montreal's housing market has been operating as what federal investigators quietly call a language laundering operation, a sophisticated scheme that uses Quebec's language laws to disguise international money laundering through real estate transactions. Toronto's crash exposed this system because suddenly, Montreal's francophone property market showed financial patterns that made no linguistic sense. Here's the explosive revelation. Properties in francophone Montreal neighborhoods are being purchased by buyers who can't speak French, using French-language corporations that exist only on paper. These shell companies exploit Quebec's language protection laws to avoid federal oversight while channeling foreign investment through fake francophone business entities. The scope is staggering. Federal investigators discovered over 4,000 Montreal properties owned by French-speaking corporations whose actual beneficial owners are overseas investors who've never been to Canada. These buyers use Quebec's language requirements as legal cover, creating fraudulent French documentation while conducting actual business in Mandarin, Arabic, or Russian. Why does this threaten Canada's sovereignty? Because Montreal's language laundering scheme allows foreign entities to control Canadian real estate while appearing to comply with both federal investment rules and provincial language laws. When Toronto crashed, investigators could finally trace money flows and discovered that an estimated $8.7 billion in questionable foreign investment has been disguised as Francophone Quebec business activity. The cultural impact is heartbreaking. Authentic Francophone Montreal families find themselves competing against fake French companies with unlimited foreign backing. Young Quebec professionals who want to live and work in French are priced out by buyers who are laundering money through fraudulent language compliance. Here's the national security angle that should alarm every Canadian. If foreign entities can use provincial language laws to circumvent federal oversight, they can potentially influence Canadian politics, economy, and culture while appearing to be legitimate Quebec businesses. But Montreal's language laundering scheme is just preparation for the banking conspiracy we discovered in our next location. Number 5. Winnipeg's Indigenous Land Rights Powder Keg. Winnipeg sits at the center of what may become Canada's most explosive housing crisis, one that intertwines Indigenous land rights, federal treaty obligations, and municipal real estate development in ways that could reshape property ownership across the entire country. Toronto's crash was just the catalyst that brought this long-simmering issue to national attention. We're not talking about remote territories. These are established neighborhoods, shopping centers, and municipal infrastructure built on property whose legal ownership status remains disputed under federal treaty law. The legal complexity is staggering. When Toronto's market crashed, nervous investors began conducting deeper due diligence on property investments nationwide. What they discovered in Winnipeg shocked the legal community. Thousands of property titles that appear legally sound under provincial law may be invalid under federal Indigenous rights legislation that takes legal precedence. Why should this terrify every property owner in Canada? Because the legal principle established in Winnipeg could theoretically be applied to property disputes across the country. If federal courts rule that provincial property titles can be invalidated by unresolved Indigenous land claims, it would create legal uncertainty for millions of Canadian property owners, not just in Winnipeg. The human drama is intensely personal. Winnipeg families who purchased homes in good faith, with proper legal documentation and clear titles, may discover their property ownership is legally questionable. These aren't wealthy speculators. They're teachers, nurses, small business owners who saved for years to buy homes that might legally belong to Indigenous communities under treaty rights. Here's the emotional complexity that makes this situation unprecedented. Indigenous communities have legitimate historical claims to land that was taken without proper legal process, but current property owners are also innocent parties who purchased land through established legal systems. Resolving this requires balancing historical justice with current economic reality. The timeline creates additional urgency. Federal legislation introduced in 2023 strengthened indigenous land rights while creating a 3-year window for communities to file formal claims. Winnipeg has 47 separate indigenous communities within treaty territories that overlap with current municipal boundaries. Legal experts estimate that resolving these claims could take decades and cost billions in compensation or property transfers. But here's the terrifying escalation. If Winnipeg establishes legal precedent that federal indigenous rights supersede provincial property law, similar challenges could emerge in Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, and virtually every Canadian city built on traditional indigenous territories. Yet even this constitutional crisis pales beside the banking fraud we uncovered in our next location. Number 4, Edmonton's corporate ownership web. Edmonton has become the testing ground for what banking investigators call corporate ownership layering, a sophisticated scheme where single entities control hundreds of residential properties through complex webs of numbered companies, holding trusts and shell corporations. Toronto's crash exposed this system when investigators could finally track money flows that revealed the true scale of corporate residential ownership. Here's the stunning statistic that should alarm every Canadian. 34% of Edmonton's single-family homes are owned not by families, but by corporate entities designed to obscure true ownership. These aren't rental companies or legitimate investment firms. They're elaborate legal structures created specifically to concentrate residential property ownership while avoiding taxes, regulations, and public scrutiny. The investigation revealed a master scheme involving over 200 interconnected companies that control approximately 15,000 Edmonton residential properties. The beneficial ownership traces back to just 12 individuals and entities, meaning that a dozen decision-makers effectively control the housing supply for a city of over 1 million people. Why does this threaten Canadian democracy? Because when housing becomes controlled by shadowy corporate networks, ordinary citizens lose the ability to build wealth through home ownership, while faceless entities manipulate local housing supply for profit. Edmonton families compete not against other families, but against corporate algorithms designed to maximize rental income and property appreciation. The economic manipulation is sophisticated. These corporate networks use predictive software to identify neighborhoods primed for gentrification, then systematically purchase properties before values increase. They coordinate rental pricing across hundreds of units to artificially inflate market rates. Most disturbing, they lobby municipal governments for zoning changes that benefit their property portfolios. The human cost is profound. Edmonton's corporate ownership web has created a rental market where tenants unknowingly pay rent to the same corporate network regardless of which property they choose. Young professionals who save to buy homes discover they're bidding against corporate entities with unlimited financing capabilities. Here's the national threat. If Edmonton's corporate ownership model proves profitable, these networks will expand to other Canadian cities. We're potentially witnessing the transformation of Canadian residential real estate from individual home ownership to corporate feudalism. But corporate ownership networks seem transparent compared to the international banking scandal we discovered in our next location. Number 3. Quebec City's pension fund Ponzi scheme. Quebec City has been operating what federal investigators now recognize as the largest pension fund fraud in Canadian history, a scheme that used municipal employee pension contributions to artificially inflate local real estate values while enriching pension fund managers and connected real estate developers. Toronto's crash provided the economic shock that finally exposed this decades-long conspiracy. Here's the explosive revelation. Quebec City's municipal pension fund has been using employee retirement contributions to purchase local real estate at inflated prices from developers who then kick back profits to pension fund managers. This circular scheme created artificial demand that drove up property values while generating fraudulent returns that masked the fund's actual insolvency. The scale is breathtaking. Over $2.3 billion in Quebec City, Municipal employee pension contributions have been diverted through this real estate laundering scheme over the past 15 years. The pension fund claims healthy returns of 8 to 12% annually, but those returns exist only because the fund is buying overpriced real estate from its own business partners using money that belongs to city employees. Why should this outrage every Canadian taxpayer? Because Quebec City's pension fraud represents money that ultimately comes from federal transfer payments and taxpayer-funded municipal operations. When this scheme collapses, Canadian taxpayers will likely fund the bailout required to honor pension obligations to innocent municipal employees. The human tragedy is devastating. Quebec City municipal employees, firefighters, police officers, public works staff, administrators, have been unknowingly funding a real estate scam with their own retirement savings. These dedicated public servants face retirement with pension funds that may be worth 60 to 70% less than their statements indicate. The investigation revealed shocking details about how the scheme operated. Pension fund managers would approve real estate purchases at prices 40 to 50% above market value, then receive consulting fees from the developers who sold the overpriced properties. Number 2. Saskatchewan's agricultural land banking cartel. Saskatchewan has become the epicenter of what agricultural economists call land banking cartelization, a coordinated scheme where foreign agricultural investment funds systematically purchase Canadian farmland, then artificially restrict agricultural production to manipulate global commodity prices. Toronto's housing crash was just a symptom of this much larger economic manipulation that threatens Canada's food sovereignty. Here's the mind-blowing scope. Foreign investment entities now control over 2.7 million acres of Saskatchewan agricultural land, an area larger than Prince Edward Island, through complex ownership structures designed to circumvent Canadian foreign ownership restrictions. These entities aren't farming the land, they're banking it as a commodity manipulation tool. The scheme works through sophisticated coordination. Agricultural investment funds purchase prime Saskatchewan farmland at above-market prices, then deliberately reduce production or leave land entirely fallow. This artificial scarcity drives up global grain prices, generating profits that far exceed what traditional farming would produce. Saskatchewan's most fertile agricultural land is being weaponized as a global commodity manipulation tool. Why does this threaten Canadian national security? Because food production represents strategic sovereignty. When foreign entities control significant portions of Canada's agricultural capacity, they can potentially manipulate Canadian food prices, export capabilities, and even create artificial famines to influence Canadian political decisions. Saskatchewan agricultural land prices have increased 340% in regions where foreign investment funds are most active, far exceeding increases justified by commodity prices or agricultural productivity. Local farming families find themselves unable to expand operations or pass land to the next generation because they're competing against unlimited foreign capital. The human impact devastates rural communities. Multi-generational Saskatchewan farming families watch their neighbors sell to foreign investment funds, then see that productive agricultural land go unused. Rural communities lose population as farming becomes economically unviable for Canadian families, while foreign entities profit from artificial scarcity. Argentina and Australia. They're creating artificial global food scarcity to manipulate commodity markets, while governments struggle to regulate entities operating across multiple jurisdictions. The timeline is urgent. Agricultural economists estimate that foreign entities could control majority ownership of Saskatchewan's prime agricultural land within 8 years, if current trends continue. Once foreign control reaches that threshold, Canada loses practical sovereignty over its own food production capacity. But Saskatchewan's agricultural crisis leads us to the most shocking discovery of all. Number 1. Toronto's banking derivatives. Nuclear bomb. Toronto's 40% housing crash wasn't just a real estate correction. It was the detonation of a derivatives time bomb that exposes how Canada's entire banking system has been operating as a massive, interconnected gambling operation using residential real estate as collateral for speculative investments that dwarf the country's entire GDP. Here's the apocalyptic truth that Mark Carney desperately wants hidden. Canadian banks have created over $2.1 trillion, meaning our banking system has created derivative exposure equivalent to 80% of the nation's total economic output. The mechanism is diabolically complex. Banks bundle Canadian mortgages into securities, then create derivatives that bet on whether those securities will increase or decrease in value. They then create derivatives on the derivatives, and derivatives on those derivatives, creating a pyramid of speculative investments where a single mortgage default can trigger billions in losses across multiple financial institutions. When Toronto's market crashed 40%, it triggered margin calls on derivatives positions that forced banks to sell additional real estate holdings to cover losses, which accelerated the crash and triggered more margin calls. This created a death spiral where declining real estate values forced more selling, which caused further declines in an accelerating feedback loop. Why does this threaten the entire Canadian economy? Because the derivatives exposure is so massive that a complete housing market collapse could bankrupt multiple major Canadian banks simultaneously. The federal government would face choosing between allowing the banking system to collapse or spending hundreds of billions in taxpayer money to bail out speculative investments that never should have been legal. The international implications are terrifying. Canadian bank derivatives are interconnected with global financial markets, meaning a Canadian banking collapse could trigger international financial contagion. Major global banks hold Canadian housing derivatives as assets, so Toronto's crash could theoretically trigger bank failures in New York, London, or Tokyo. The human cost is beyond calculation. Ordinary Canadians who simply wanted to buy homes have unknowingly become collateral in a massive financial gambling operation. Their mortgages have been bundled, repackaged, and used as the foundation for speculative investments that generate profits for banks while creating systemic risk that could destroy the entire economy. Here's the timeline that should terrify every Canadian. Derivatives positions must be marked to market quarterly, meaning banks must acknowledge losses every 3 months. If real estate values continue declining, banks will face escalating losses that could exhaust their capital reserves within 18 months. Mark Carney's panic isn't about housing affordability or economic policy. It's about preventing the public from understanding that Canada's banking system has essentially become a casino where the house money is taxpayer deposits and the betting chips are Canadian homes. So there you have it. 10 interconnected crises that make Toronto's 40% housing crash look like just the opening act of a much larger economic catastrophe. From Vancouver's shadow banking to Toronto's derivatives nuclear bomb, we're witnessing the unraveling of economic systems that have been operating outside public scrutiny for years. The question isn't whether these systems will collapse, but whether Canadians will demand accountability before the damage becomes irreversible. What do you think about these revelations? Are you prepared for the economic disruption that seems inevitable? Let us know your thoughts in the comments and tell us which of these crises concerns you most.